Good morning. My name is Mariam Abbas Ali Habibi, and today me and my friend Vanida Tanveer Iqbal will be presenting on the chapter The Development of a Modern Western Sufism in the book Sufism and the West by Celia A. Jen. So, we see how in recent times Jalaluddin Rumi's poetry has taken prominence in North America and Europe and has brought Sufism into the attention of many Westerners in a liberal and a liberating way. The idea that Sufism should stimulate receptivity to Islam is not a new phenomenon. Sufism's encounter with the modern West over the last century has historically proved to bring Islam into new cultures. Since Sufi masters teach that one may experience God directly and not just through the Quran and Sunnah, their movements generate familiar tensions among Muslims who are concerned that orthodoxy not be eroded by heterodox innovations, bid'ah. The encounter of Sufism with the West also creates new tensions as this ancient tradition grapples with 20th and 21st century processes of modernization in religious and other institutions. This chapter is about number one, the international Sufi movement. This movement is one of the earliest and most prominent Sufi movements in the West, which has recruited primarily Western participants. The Indian Sufi master Hazrat Inayat Khan established this Sufi order in North America and Europe between 1910 and 1926. It was brought to Australia soon after, and over the 20th century became established on virtually every continent. By teaching in English and not requiring prior conversion to Islam, Inayat was the first to make Sufism widely accessible to Westerners. For over 50 years, this was virtually the only Sufi order in the West and the only group readily available to Westerners. In migrant and non-migrant communities in the West, Sufism is taught through both traditional Muslim orders and non-traditional institutions. The latter include groups blending traditional and universalistic elements such as the Naqshbandi Haqqani order and the Baba Muhyiddin Fellowship, and groups with a universalist focus such as Inayat Khan's Sufi movement. Here, the term universalist is, of course, used in the sense of available or belonging to all people, not just those of a particular ethnic or religious background. This chapter is also about how viewing Western Sufi groups as new religious movements (NRMs) can aid understanding of how Sufi traditions change in response to modernity and the need to indigenize in the Western environment. Also, treating Inayat Khan's Sufi movement as an NRM to assist in identifying important factors in its development, as well as to reflect on the social and cultural processes distinctive of the Asian imported religious traditions, um, more broadly in the modern social context, and on the adaptation experiences common to the other Sufi groups in the West. In doing so, the author shows the importance of the movement's historical background, specifically the Indian heritage of its founder Hazrat Inayat Khan, as well as the founder's intention to formulate a new vision of Sufism in the modern social environment of the West. The author argues that for Inayat Khan's Sufi movement, its particular Indian cultural roots are especially important. This is because Islam and Sufism developed somewhat differently in India than in other parts of the Islamic world. And lastly, the chapter is about how the new formal and transnational organizational form adopted by the Inayati order helps explain the history of the ruptures that have occurred within the group. While traditional pre-modern Sufi orders were often transnational, this was only in the sense that informal links between masters and their initiates stretched across state boundaries. The Inayati order, however, adopted a variety of elements from Western culture, including a formal organization and the new communication technologies that appeared over the 20th century to coordinate its worldwide activities in groups. Adopting this formal transnational organizational pattern, unprecedented in Indian Sufi orders, has both potentiated and constrained the group's development. The author does this by first looking at the role of the cultural heritage and intentions of Inayat Khan in the development and adaptation of the order in the West. Secondly, the author outlines the development of the organizational structure of the Sufi movement in Europe and North America and the tensions evident in that evolution. And thirdly, she turns to the Australian experience and considers the role of the cultural heritage, the founder's specific vision, the formal organization, and modern communications in the three main phases of the evolution of the United Sufism there. Cultural heritage and intention in a transnational NRM. Inayat Khan was trained by his Murshid, Khwaja Muhammad Abu Hashim Madani, primarily within the Nizami branch of the Chishti order. This Indian Sufi order was characteristically inclusive and tolerant of religious pluralism, and included music (sama) along with prayer and zikr, for the remembrance of God as a key spiritual practice. Like other orders, it also upheld the central role of the spiritual teacher, Pir or Murshid, the disciple's relationship of trust and obedience with his or her teacher, and the sense of Pir Bhai or the brotherhood community of disciples of a particular teacher. The Chistiya order was founded in India by Hazrat Khwaja Muhyiddin Chisti, who left his home in what is now Afghanistan for India in the 12th century CE. Entering this pluralistic environment, Khwaja emphasized a message of universal love and peace. He chose the way of no compulsion in religion, drawing to Islam many Indians who were inspired by him. Muhyiddin Chisti was instrumental in creating in India a rich, composite culture blending Islamic and indigenous cultures that were reflected in art, music, religion, and philosophy. 7 centuries later, in 1910, his spiritual descendant, Sufi Inayat Khan, left his home in India to bring Sufism to the West. While Inayat Khan was a Muslim, the object of his mission to the West was not formal conversion to Islam. He took instead a different approach, which he described as providing personal guidance on the path in the problems of both outer life and inner life, without requiring belief in any special creed or dogma. His adaptation was by redefining the relationship between Sufism and the exoteric tradition and practice of Islam. Inayat Khan's Sufi movement drew on its Chishti heritage to resolve the tension between the universal, experiential, and theological dimensions of Sufism and the ritual and legal particularisms of Islam. Another key aspect of Inayat Khan's Sufi movement was its gender. As early as in 1914, Inayat Khan wrote, "I can see as clear as daylight that the time has come when women will lead humanity on to a higher education." From the beginning of his work in the West, he actively promoted women within the order. Key aspects of Inayat Khan's Sufi message, such as the unity of religious ideals, were conveyed through creating new rituals within the order, such as the universal worship service. In this service, respect for the unity and diversity of the world's religions is shown through lighting candles for each major tradition and sometimes reading from the scripture of each. Inayat Khan believed that spiritual development and full realization of the meaning of the unity of religious ideals also required the inner purification and transformation of individuals. For this, he retained traditional institutions such as the Murshid-Murid relationship and many of the traditional Chishti spiritual practices. Inayat Khan made ongoing efforts to get to know the West, and as his knowledge and mission evolved, he continued to adapt his presentation. For example, while his early lectures contained much Islamic terminology, he soon employed examples and metaphors from science, Christianity, and everyday Western life to convey his message. He distinguished mysticism from any form of religious dogma, explaining that people mostly think that the spiritual message must be something concrete and definite in the way of doctrines and principles, but that does not belong to the divine nature, which is unlimited and is life itself. At times, Inayat discovered defined Sufism simply as the religion of the heart, the religion in which one thing is most important, and that is to seek God in the heart of mankind. This approach was, he believed, part of a new spiritual awakening in the world. Institutionalizing a Sufi order in a formal organization. Initially, as Inayat Khan traveled and taught in North America, Russia, the UK, and Europe, he simply initiated interested people and gave them instruction and practices. But as numbers grew, however, he realized that administration and development of his order required a formal organization. So, in 1923, he incorporated the International Sufi movement in Geneva in the form that continues today. The introduction of a formal incorporated organization for his work introduced an organizational pattern unprecedented in Indian Sufi orders. The organization as a whole and each of the activities within it is structured hierarchically with overall authority in the representative general who is also the Pir Murshid. The administrative structure of the organization he established consists of an international executive committee and international and national councils for 5 subsidiary activities, each of which is represented to the executive committee. The central activity is the esoteric school or Sufi order within which initiation, the Murshid-Murid relationship, and spiritual training take place. The sister and brotherhood, spiritual healing, and spiritual symbology activities respectively reflect, though they also expand, restructure, and formalize the ethos of service, healing capacities and vocations, and use of symbolism traditionally found within the Chistiya order. The universal worship activity was developed to allow followers of all religions to come together and is a significant innovation and departure from traditional Sufism. For a spiritual tradition that has been carried previously by traditional informal organization and informal networks, incorporation as a formal organization has a range of implications, of course. For Westerners, a formal organization carries expectations of values and procedures common to other modern voluntary organizations, such as everyone being eligible for office and member initiative. Such expectations, however, clash with the values of classical Sufi and other institutions. Embedding the concept of spiritual hierarchy and guidance within a formal organization also exposes cultural tensions between the traditional Muslim understanding that there should be no fundamental divide between worldly and spiritual life, and the modern Western notions that these should be kept separate. A formal organization also imposes certain constraints on a group, including strain towards coherence and consistency. Hierarchical structures, such as that found in Ayati Sufi movement, are frequently criticized as inappropriate to the modern world and a liability to the organization. In NRM, such as the Sufi movement, there are therefore often ongoing issues as to effective and appropriate authority structures and how to balance the need for members and willing workers with quality control and integrity of the tradition. After Inayat Khan's unexpected death in 1927, at the age of just 44, on a return trip to India, the social dynamics changed quite drastically and led to a number of ruptures. In 1929, the original international Sufi movement split into a European branch led by Sheikhul Mashaikh Mehboob Khan, who was Inayat Khan's brother and companion in the West, and an American branch led by Rabia Martin, the woman who was Inayat Khan's first disciple in the West and whom he appointed as Murshida. Following this early split, the international Sufi movement, the European branch, has continued under a succession of leaders with Inayat Khan's younger son, Piro Murshid Hidayat Inayat Khan, as the current representative general. Two additional offshoots, Sufi Way and Sufi Contact, one in Great Britain and one in the Netherlands, were formed around 1980. As in the earliest rupture, these were created by murids who, for different reasons, were unhappy with certain decisions at headquarters and saw their primary loyalty to a particular guide within the order rather than the organization as a whole. The first American branch collapsed in late 1940s. In the late 1950s, a clash between Eastern and Sufi values of obedience and spiritual readiness and Western initiative and expectations led Inayat Khan's elder son, Peer Vilayat, to break with the international Sufi movement. Collaborating with Samuel Lewis, also known as Murshid Sam, the creator of the Dances of Universal Peace, Peer Vilayat started what is now called the Sufi Order International in the United States. His son, Peer Zia, is the current leader. In 1977, when Sir Vilayat attempted to impose certain policies on all groups and murids in his Sufi order, murids initiated by Samuel Lewis, Murshid Sam, broke away to form a new organization which was called the Sufi Ruhaniyat International. The three major branches, which are the movement, the order, and the Ruhaniyat, are now all separate, but they're still very similar transnational organizations. Unlike in many religious groups, ruptures within the Inayati order have not occurred over the correct interpretation of doctrines or teachings. Most splits have occurred from the clash in values between the organizational structure and the ethos out of which it operates. In conclusion, these early developments made Sufi training, tradition, philosophy, and practices available to everybody, not just Muslims. They presented Sufism in a way that could readily be practiced within a modern and increasingly secular society. Inayat Khan's lack of dogma and use of music were appealing in the West, although the organizational and spiritual hierarchy and Murshid-Murid relationship were understood less well and received a mixed response. Inayat Khan did not replicate traditional Indian Sufism but drew on strands within the Chistiya order in his first stage of developing a new and Western form of Sufism. For Inayat Khan, the changes were not a compromise with the West, but rather an integral part of his vision for religion in the modern world. As this account of the organizational development shows, the combination in this Sufi order of a modern, formal, transnational, sort of voluntary organization with a charismatic monarchical model of spiritual authority, it ends up creating a dualism of principle that has never been entirely resolved. While personalities and other issues have played a part, the social dynamics inherent in the pull between these organizational forms have largely accounted for the history of ruptures. Thank you.
So now I'm going to be leading this part of the presentation. So earlier we had seen the different factors through which Inayati Sufism had been shaped as compared to the form in which it had initially arrived Australia. And the factors include the origins of Inayat Khan's Sufi movement in the Indian Chishti Sufi tradition, early adaptations made by Inayat Khan in accordance with his mystical vision for religion in the modern world. For instance, pragmatic decisions like adopting a formal organization. These factors, along with the early rupture between the European and American branches after Inayat Khan's death, have also influenced the ongoing development of the international Sufi movement in Australia. The Australian story also shows how the newness of a new religious movement in the West poses particular challenges as well as opportunities for a tradition, and how the emerging communications technologies and other social and religious trends of the 20th and 21st centuries provide ongoing stimulus for change. Moreover, the author Celia uh, explores these processes by considering the three main phases through which the Inayati Sufi order has now passed in Australia. So, phase one is the early Australian encounter with Sufism from 1927 to 1950, and phase two, which is the founding of the Sufi movement in Australia from 1950 to 1990, and phase three, which is the contemporary Western Sufi community and its evolving organizations from 1990 onwards.
So now I am going to be discussing phase 1. So Inayati Sufism began in Australia when Baron von Frankenberg immigrated in 1927, the same year that the founder died in India. Although Van Frankenberg's father was a German aristocrat and his mother was born in Australia, he grew up in the United States and Germany. He had become a murid in 1925 and spent around 6 months with Murshid Inayat Khan, his Sufi master, at the annual Sufi summer schools near Paris. Also, another interesting fact about von Frankenberg is that he was also known as Sheikh Momin by one of his murids. Von Frankenberg was associated with the early American branch of the order and was appointed as its Australian representative in the mid 1930s. For a time, all was going well, but von Frankenberg's active and enthusiastic Sufi societies in Melbourne and Sydney um, provided an alternative spiritual path to many in a predominantly Christian society from the 1930s to the late 1940s. However, von Frankenberg's group did not survive. When Rabia Martin, leader of the American branch, had died in 1947, her designated successor, Ivy Deuce, felt unqualified for the role. So Deuce soon took the step of handing over the Inayati order to a spiritual teacher from a different tradition. This teacher, Meher Baba, convinced Deuce that he was the avatar of the age and that Inayat Khan wanted his order to become part of Meher Baba's organization. In Australia, as also in America, the order had split. While some of the Murids in each country had followed Deuce in his new direction, but more disagreed, and they also lacked a leader, and also many had drifted away. Von Frankenberg appeared unable to take a clear stand, and with his death soon after in the 1950s, the first phase of the Sufi movement in Australia had come to an end.
So, there are several reasons as to why the Sufi movement had come to an end towards Australia. So, first generation members were quite enthusiastic, but they lacked experience. For instance, von Frankenberg, who had stepped into positions of responsibility, he lacked periods of training with Inayat Khan, and there were huge gaps in communication and technology, because of which von Frankenberg was geographically isolated. And Inayat Khan's death had also cut off this group from the depth of experience available in Europe. And there were also government restrictions on on persons from German nationality or having a German name during World War II. And because of this reason, um, von Frankenberg had restricted his meetings towards his home, and and the Murids were only able to contact him through letter during the years, and this had obviously weakened the group. Um, and fourth reason is that there were organizational and esoteric issues of authority. And so the Murids had different understandings of who or what constituted the master and who would they pledge alliance to, the founder Inayat Khan or to Deuce as the current head of the branch with which they were associated, or to their individual initiator von Frankenberg or to someone or something else. And another reason is that the Westerners were internalizing imagined or aggrandized Eastern values without fully understanding the nuances of the different traditions that carried them. And there was ambiguity in understanding the universal or unity of religious ideas perspective taught by Inayat Khan. And there was also confusions of loyalties and conflicting pulls in the transnational organization. So it is crucial for us to understand what does universality mean for Inayat Khan. So it means the unity of religious ideals and the brotherhood and sisterhood of all humanity, which is a central tenet in his Sufi movement. So it is crucial for us to keep this in mind while understanding Inayat Khan's new religious movement ideals. Phase of the Sufi movement in Australia, which was from 1950 to 1990. And so the second phase had started under Sharif Jansen in 1958. And Jansen was a Dutch. He grew up in Indonesia and had migrated to Australia in 1951. And he was a murid of Inayat Khan's brother Musharraf Khan. And in 1958, he was appointed as the national representative for Australia, affiliated this time with the European branch, and his early Sufi groups included New People as well as some from the groups of von Frankenberg. And in 1967, Johnson had a harmonious relationship with the international organization and regular correspondence with Musharraf Khan. In 1975, Sheriff Jansen and his wife attended the annual summer school in the Netherlands, but found the new leader, Fazl Inayat Khan, to be very different in style from his predecessors. Fazl had attracted a large number of alternative people, introduced practices from the human potential movements alongside Sufi activities. Shortly, Sharif Jansen died in 1990, but while doing so, he continued to follow what he believed were the instructions of his murshid, even when this meant leaving the organization. So, how did Sharif Johnson become more successful as compared to von Frankenberg in the first phase? So, um, Sharif Johnson was a murid of Inayat Khan's brother Musharraf Khan. So, he had first-hand experience of the teachings of Inayat Khan, and he had more experience as compared to von Frankenberg. And Johnson used to closely follow Inayat Khan's teachings, and he insisted on the establishment of a disciplined, ethical lifestyle as a prerequisite to a more advanced training. And he was a strong leader and who required his murids to regularly attend their Sufi classes. Johnson had received a deep and traditional inner Sufi training from Musharraf Khan, and he wanted to pass on this form of training to his murids. And he had also discouraged his murids to combine any of these teachings with other spiritual paths and teachings which were available at that time. And his understanding of the Murshid Murid relationship led him to resist in Australia the changes taking place elsewhere in the transnational organization, meaning that his personal charisma, his loyalty towards his murids, and him having the sole leadership in Australia really helped him uh, slow down the changes in the new religious movement. So now I am going to be discussing phase three, which is the contemporary Western Sufi community and its evolving organization. So from the start of around 1990s, modern communication technologies with the greater ease of travel and increasing involvement with the transnational organization had created a massive shift in the Australian Sufi movement. So an event that took place around 1990, shortly before Sharif Janssen's death, shows some of the issues that are now shaping the third contemporary phase of the group, and some of the tensions that had actually already been building before the event. So the event, which was that while Murshid was in the hospital, the Sydney Murids continued to gather regularly for study, zikr, music, and other practices. On one such occasion, a long-time murid and musician wanted to share her inspiration of putting to music a prayer given by Inayat Khan. With a new first line that did not attribute gender to the divine, she had replaced the words "Beloved Lord, Almighty God" with "O Thou, the healing Spirit of all." The group had begun to sing when a male murid interrupted and said that Inayat Khan had asked that his words not be changed. Doing so, the murid said, was disrespectful to Inayat Khan and to Sharif Jansen, and as a murid he felt obliged to stop it. So, this, uh, so these issues raised by the incident related to gender, language, the practice of the Murshid-Murid relationship, hierarchical power versus self-authority in spiritual guidance, rituals and practices, hierarchy versus demographic principles, and organization matters and style of decision making and autonomy. So after Johnson's death, tensions over these issues were great enough to rupture the group, and two separate groups were formed. The first one was the Sufi movement in Australia, uh, which is more traditional in the sense of closely following Sufism as taught by Inayat Khan, and the Sufi Order International and the Sufi Ruhaniyat International, which have also developed a presence in Australia. So, a significant and related ongoing issue for the groups is the different understandings and practice of the Murshid-Murid relationship. While Inayat Khan made a number of adaptations to traditional Sufism, he saw this relationship as intrinsic to the Sufi path and training and emphasized steadfastness within it. Moreover, modern communication technologies and increasingly active engagement in the formal transnational international Sufi movement organization are changing the practice of Inayati Sufism in Australia and elsewhere as they are transforming those of other transnational Sufi orders. The processes are somewhat parallel to those that are transforming Muslim identities from essentially local cultural identities to more homogenized globalized religious identities. So the changes in the Western cultural context over the course of 20th century, particularly of increased gender equity and less authoritarian and less formal relationships generally, have challenged many spiritual traditions, not just the United Order. While the challenge of resolving cultural tensions within a new formal transnational organization has contributed to ruptures within the United movement, this organizational structure is paradoxically also showing wider allegiances to form in the future. So, my concluding thoughts are that the NIT movement, as a new religious movement, has adopted a distinct 20th century tool of a formal organization and has used advances in communications, but that have enabled it to increasingly increase interaction and coordination within a formal voluntary organization. And however, the various ruptures within the NIT group occurred largely due to frictions between the formal organizational structure and the hierarchical concept of spiritual authority. Whereas the transnational organizational structure adopted by the Anaiti Order and other Asian origin NRMs in the West is allowing the emergence across borders of a new kind of religion that emphasizes interior spirituality and personal experience and an inclusive vision transcending traditional ethnic, religious, and organizational boundaries. However, identifying the problematic organizational dynamics has also helped to explain the distinctive pattern of continuity and innovation in this modern Western Sufi movement. Moreover, Inayat Khan's Sufi movement does not completely adhere to some elements of orthodoxy which we can usually find in Muslim majority countries, for example, Pakistan. However, the group still defines itself as a Sufi order and it has several structural features such as a silsila, which is known as a chain of transmission, and the central teacher disciple murshid murid relationship, and the spiritual practices such as zikr, which are a general distinctive characteristic of Sufi orders. And however, while the movement is quite innovative, it is not alone among Sufi groups in this regard, and it is not the only substantially non-migrant Sufi group that has responded creatively to a Western and modern global context. Lastly, Nayati Sufism's appreciation of intolerance for the followers of all faiths and its valuing of spiritual freedom and experience brings forward the characteristics of a centuries-old Sufi and Islamic tradition into the modern world and resonates within the conditions of modernity. Thank you.